She was hanging there like a hunted animal. Her wrists and ankles pulled wide by rough ropes. Her dress torn. Her face streaked with dust, sweat, and shame. And the midday sun of Dodge City burned down on her skin until it looked ready to blister. Rosa Miller was barely 22, and she no longer had the strength to scream. Only a dry whisper slipped from her cracked lips every time the rope tightened against her shoulders. She had been left in the middle of the Kansas plains, left to suffer, left to break. A breeze swept across the tall summer grass. No mercy came with it. The wooden A-frame that held her creaked with each gust as if mocking her weight. Her toes hovered above the ground. Every second felt like the next might be her last. She had not been up there all day, but a few hours in that sun felt close enough to forever. Rosa had known she would be punished for stealing from Sheriff Eli Thompson. She just never imagined punishment would look like this. She thought she would be locked in a cell. Not displayed like a warning for anyone who dared to cross the law of Dodge City. Her breath came shallow. Then came the sound of hooves, slow, steady. Approaching from behind the hills with the lazy rhythm of a man who had no idea he was riding straight into another person's suffering. Jim Blake appeared from the shimmer of the heat. A rancher in his late 40s. Withered face, calm eyes, a man used to storms both on the land and inside the human heart. He pulled his horse to a stop, his gaze locked onto the figure hanging in the sun. Smoke flashed through his eyes, then anger, then something far quieter, something like pity. He stepped closer. Rosa lifted her head with the little strength she had left. She thought he was here to finish what Sheriff Thompson started. Her voice trembled like something already half dead. Don't do this," she whispered. Jim froze, not because of the words, but because of the way she said them, as if she had already accepted that mercy didn't exist for someone like her. He reached for the ropes. She flinched. It didn't stop. He studied every knot, every bruise, every wound her body carried. And in that moment, Jim Blake knew one thing with absolute clarity. Whatever crime this girl had committed, nothing could justify this. His hand tightened on the handle of his knife. The plains were silent. The sun burned hotter. And Rose Miller hung between life and death. While a rancher she had never met made a choice that would change both of their lives forever. If Jim Blake cuts her down, will the law come for him next and erase them both before the truth ever sees daylight? The knife flashed once in the sun. Then Jim Blake cut the rope. Rosa dropped like a sack of grain. He caught her halfway, her weight slammed into his chest. She gasped, air tearing into her lungs like fire. Her legs would not hold her at all. If he had come 5 minutes later, she might already have been gone. Jim slid an arm behind her back. Another under her knees. She was light, too light for a girl her age. He lifted her like he would a hurt calf and carried her away from that cursed A-frame. He sat her down in the shade of a scrubby tree for a while, gave her water and slow sips, and waited until her eyes could focus again before he even thought about putting her on a horse. Up close, she didn't look like a monster, just a scared kid with a stubborn jaw and eyes that refused to stay closed. Her lips trembled. "I stole from him," she whispered. "From Sheriff Thompson. He went into his office, opened his safe. Took his money." Jean didn't say anything for a moment. Her confession sat in his gut like a stone, so she really was a thief. The sheriff had not lied about that part. He set her gently in the saddle, then swung up behind her so she would not fall. Her head rested against his shoulders. The horse started moving. He could feel every shiver that ran through her. "You know he had every right to put you in a cell," Jim said quietly. "A cell," she answered, voice rough. "Not a rope in the middle of the prairie." That shut him up for a good long while. They followed the Arkansas River, the water glinting beside them. Jim kept his eyes on the trail, but his mind was a storm. He respected the law. This land turned wild without it. Yet what he had just seen didn't feel like law. It felt like cruelty dressed up as justice. By the time they reached the low hills where his ranch sat, the sun was dipping. The small house came into view. One porch, one chimney. Smoke curling lazy from the top. Jean carried Rose inside and laid her on his own bed. He poured water in a basin, tore an old shirt into strips, and started cleaning the rope burns on her wrists. She winced but didn't pull away. Tomorrow I will take you in, he said finally. You stole. You answer for that. But inside a courtroom, not hanging like a trophy. Rose stared at the ceiling. There was something else pressing behind her eyes. Something darker than simple theft. But she swallowed it down. Why tell this man that she had seen Sheriff Thompson do something far worse than anything she had done herself, for tonight? She would just be a thief who got lucky. Jean would just be a rancher who could not walk past suffering. Outside, the Kansas sky turned red and gold. And somewhere far off, a lone rider started asking questions about the girl who had gone missing from his rope. When that rider reaches this ranch, whose side will Jim Blake stand on? Morning on the Blake Ranch. Started quiet. Too quiet for what was coming. Jean was up before the sun like always. He fed the horses, checked the water trough, tried very hard not to look at the bedroom door where Rose was sleeping in his bed while he took the old cot by the stove. He told himself this was simple. He would take her back into town. He would stand beside her in front of the judge. The law would do what the law was meant to do. No more ropes in the middle of the prairie. That neat little plan lasted right up until he heard horses coming fast up the lane. Not a wagon, not a neighbor, 3 riders, one hard-thudding rhythm. Jean stepped out on the porch, wiping his hands on his trousers. Sheriff Eli Thompson reined in at the gate with 2 deputies behind him. Dust rolling up around all 3 horses, those sharp little eyes took in the house, the barn, the tracks. Then they settled on Jim. Morning, Blake. The sheriff smiled, but it never reached his eyes. Saying somebody cut down my thief. Jim felt the lie rising in his throat and dying halfway, so he settled for the truth. I found a girl hanging where buzzards circle. He brought her here so she didn't die like a dog. You interfered with evidence, Thompson said. She belongs in my jail. The smile was gone now. Jim shook his head. She belongs in a courtroom. What you did wasn't justice. For a second, they just stared at each other. Old rancher on the port. Man with a badge in the yard. The kind of moment that decides what kind of men they really are. Inside, Rose stood barefoot just behind the door. Every muscle tight. She could hear every word. She knew that voice. She could still taste the dust from his rope. If he took her back, there would be no trial. No second chance. Used one more ride into the heat and a quiet grave no one bothered to mark. Her heart hammered, her mouth went dry. She grabbed the door frame to steady herself, then slipped into the kitchen as the men argued. When Jim finally stepped back inside, his jaw was locked so tight it looked painful. He wants you back, Jim said. He says the rope was legal. Word was already running through Dodge City that Jim Blake had cut down the thief. So many folks called him crazy, but most said the sheriff had been shamed in front of the whole town. Rose looked at him. Really looked at him. This man had risked himself once already just by cutting her down. If she kept silent, he would walk right back into the sheriff's trap with her if she told the truth. Both of them might never see another sunrise. Her voice came out in a hoarse whisper. Jean, I did steal, but I stole the wrong thing. He took money that was never his to keep. And I saw what he did to the man it belonged to. Jean stared at her. What did you seek, Rose? She took a breath that shook her whole body. Because once she answered that question, there would be no going back for either of them. Before we follow Jim and Rose down this dark trail, go ahead and hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. And while you are here, take a sip of your coffee or tea and tell me in the comments what time is it right now and where are you listening from. Rose didn't look at Jim when she answered. She stared at the old wood floor like the truth was written there. He was cleaning the office, she said late. Sadie thought I had gone home, her hands twisted in her skirt. He heard a man come in, she said. Not Army. Just a trail-worn fellow in a dusty coat with a Wells Fargo badge on his vest. He had a leather bag on his shoulder. They argued about money, about cash that was supposed to ride the rails and never got there. Jean said nothing. He could hear his own heartbeat. Then I heard the gunshot. Rosa whispered. Used when. The messenger hit the floor. Sadie stood there with smoke coming off his pistol like it was nothing at all. She swallowed hard. He wrapped the body in a tarp, loaded it in a wagon, and drove out past the last houses down by a cut bank on the Arkansas River where folks don't go much anymore. That leather bag ended up in his safe. Same bag I stole from. He thought I was just robbing a greedy man. Turns out I stole from a grave. Silence settled thick in the room. Jim had seen bad men in his life. Cattle, thieves, thrift. But a lawman killing a messenger for money, then hanging a girl to cover it. That's that different. If we stay here, Rose said, he will come back with a rope and a story. And only one of those will be true. Jim rubbed his face, then looked toward the window where the sheriff had written in Fort Dodge. He said quietly. Soldiers there know the railroad men. They will care if a Wells Fargo bag goes missing, and the sheriff doesn't own their ear. By sundown, they were in the saddle. Jim tied a small bedroll behind his horse, tucked the stolen pay deep under his coat, and helped Rose up in front of him. She still moved like every step hurt, but her voice was steady. If we do this, there is no going back, she said. There was no going back the moment I cut you down. A answered. They followed the Arkansas River again. This time not at a walk, but at a hard, urgent run. Behind them, on the ridge near the Blake Ranch, Sheriff Thompson watched two tiny figures riding west, dust curling up behind them. His two deputies shifted in their saddles, waiting for his word. He didn't need a spyglass to understand if they reached the fort. His rope tricks were finished. His whole life was finished. He spurred his horse so hard it screamed and motioned for one deputy to ride with him while the other circled back to cover their tracks. 3 guns chasing one rancher and one girl who knew far too much. Night began to fall as Jim and Rose saw the first lanterns of Fort Dodge in the distance. Hoofbeats thundered closer behind them. If the